Okay, good morning, everyone. So we are going to finish this class by discussing a little bit stochasticity. So the first thing we're going to do is take the model that we ended up with at the last period, which was the SIR model. We are going to turn that into a model that has a bit more mechanisms into it. And then we will perform simulation in a way that is explicitly stochastic. So where we can check that the number of individuals is indeed going to remain a number of individuals. So what we're going to do here is two things. First, we're going to turn the SIR model into a model called SIRS. So what SIRS does is that after you get removed from the pool of individuals that are no longer infectious, there is a chance that you will lose this immunity, in a sense, right? So you only get immune for some period of time. And so that is an additional reaction into your networks. We're going to call that, I'm going to do something that is probably not what the textbook would do and call it delta. And that is going to be the third parameter of our model. So let's do SIRS. We are going to latexify it and check that the equation is, so that it comes out as the right mathematical formula. Let's go here, render. Perfect. So we are gaining new individuals that are formally recovered but not susceptible again. The infectious equation has not changed. We are gaining individuals through recovery and losing individuals through loss of immunity. But good, we're in business. We're going to do some sort of broad reasoning that we've had before, right? It's the loss of immunity is a rate, and a rate is 1/time. I'm just going to say that we recover from the disease in 3 units of time, and that we lose immunity in something that is probably a little bit longer. We'll say like 20 units of time. If it comes out as something that looks weird, or like not, that does not have an effect, we'll tweak the parameters until it feels right. It's a model with 3 compartments, so we need 3 variables here. We'll say 200. Okay, that's fine. Just before we move into the stochastic side of things, let's just do it as an ODE problem. That's SIRS, new note, TP. I'm going to solve that. Call that solution. Go away. And when it's done integrating, we are going to plot a solution. So that's our, oh, I got it right on my first try. Look at that. That is our model. So what is happening with our model here is at the beginning it looked just like SIR, and that we are building a group of individuals that have been removed from the population, but then after some time, which if you look at it is just about 20. That's good, because at the time we said people should start losing immunity after this time. It decreases. This decrease is turning into what? It's turning into an increase again of the fraction of the population that is susceptible. And because we were losing infectious people through recovery, but then suddenly they have a new pool of susceptible individuals that they can infect, and so they're increasing again. And so the dynamic of this particular epidemic is a lot more complex than the one that we had before, because there is some oscillations that are happening now. I just think it's fascinating that we just had this one parameter. I'd say after a while, you're going to lose your immunity, and it's going to change the behavior of the system, where it used to be, fairly linear, and it reached a nice little plateau, and it stopped there, and now we have these oscillations. So the question, of course, is what if we change the timing of that? What if it only takes 10 days to lose your immunity. Well, we have a lower, we still have some oscillation, but they're more condensed. What if it takes 60 days? We also have some oscillation, and they take a lot longer to settle because the people are starting to lose their immunity massively by this point, approximately, right? And so that's interesting because we have a completely different behavior of the system just because we added this one parameter. And depending on the timing, we can have extremely different parameters, different outcomes. What if it takes 200 days to lose your immunity? Well, we have very long cyclical dynamics of the epidemic over time. We can go for like 1,000 time steps and see what's happening. And we have something that looks like it's almost, seasonal. It ends up stabilizing over time for a bunch of different reasons, but we can have this complex behavior with multiple waves and multiple peaks because immunity is something that can wane off after some point. I get easily overexcited about models of epidemics. I think they're really neat. The models, not the epidemics. So that's our model, right? SIRS. It's a classic. One thing that we want to do, there's two things I'd like to do in the next half hour that we have. The first is convert that into a stochastic model. And by that I mean the quantities beta, gamma, delta, they're rates. And rates, in a sense, they're probability of random events. If a rate is really high, then the event is very likely. If the rate is really low, the event is very unlikely. There's a way that we can transform a rate into a probability. So what we're going to do here is, instead of solving it as an ordinary differential equation problem, we are going to solve it as a discrete problem that is going to implement a whole different family of algorithms. So we are going to specify the hyperparameters. Let's say here's the time span, and here is the initial population size. And instead of saying that is a ODE problem, we're going to call that a jump problem. There are a few other stochastic solvers in defect biological, but we can specify this as a jump problem for the time being. We are going to do this, and so we can do our time series here. So before I plot that, and I'm going to plot that and we'll discuss after. What's happening here is that we have something that looks noisy, and it's looking noisy for all the right reasons, which is that sometimes, you have a rate that is 0.2, but sometimes, by chance, you'll get an effective rate that is higher than that. And sometimes, by chance, you'll get an effective rate that is lower than that. So in addition to the dynamics of the model that are deterministic, we have a dynamic of the model that is stochastic around that. And in fact, we could overlay, is it dash? I think it's dash. We could overlay the deterministic model on top. And we can see that, well, it's following the same general trend, but there can be some fairly significant deviations from the model because of the stochasticity, right? And that's important, and that's important in some very specific situation. Let's get back to the very first model we had, the second model we had, the SIS. We know that for some combination of parameters, the disease is not able to establish. So if you just increase transmissibility a little bit, it would be able to establish. But if you add the limit and you add some stochasticity, then by chance, a disease that from a purely mathematical point of view is able to invade might just have a streak of bad luck and not be able to invade. On the other hand, we can have a disease that should not be able to invade, and then we are the unlucky one, and then it's able to invade because of stochasticity. And what is interesting is that when you start thinking of these problems in terms of not being a single curve, but being multiple realization of stochastic processes, what you have is a range of scenarios that can emerge. So let's do, because if we do, let's plot time series again. If we rerun that a bit, I'm just going to start a new plot here. I'm going to start a new plot and do a number of things manually because new plot. Okay. And we'll do for I in, we'll do 20 just to start. We'll plot the time series and we'll set the color ourselves. And the colors that I want are going to be, I'm going to say blue for infected, for susceptible, red for infectious, and gray for removed. And no legend. So we're going to do a 10 little simulation here, and then plot the time. I think it's interesting to see that it's longer to plot the results than it is to do the actual simulation. The numerical integration of differential equation in Julia is incredibly fast. So you could be very ambitious in the sort of simulation that you do. We're just going to let the plot package do its little thing, and then we're going to look at what the endpoint of that is. But what is important is that what we will see on this plot is that there is going to be a range of possible time courses for the epidemics, right? Not only within the individual compartments, but also across different compartments. So we can see some variation. And it's always important to say, we do the mathematical analysis of a model so that it tells us something about what we expect. But this expectation is not accounting for the contingencies of real life and the fact that a lot of processes we have are actually stochastic. I think it would be cool if we could have the plot. I don't know what's going on. It's probably because I messed up something with the colors. Let me just close all the plots. That is working, yeah. I don't know what's going on with this plot, and I don't feel like doing it properly, so I am going to do it the bad way, because that's not really what we care about for the moment. Oh, it was here. Okay, well, too bad. Let's get back a little bit with my plot control. Yeah, I think it's because there's a lot of plots to add. So we're just going to do. Let me just check. It's black, red, and gray. Does that work? Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. It's tuple. Who cares? And then no lab. So I'm just going to draw like a number of simulations on top of that. So what is interesting, that I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that even in a model for which we know that the epidemic is able to persist, we have some situation where it doesn't. Where because there's a single individual at the beginning, that the fact that it's a series of stochastic events means that we don't see the epidemic starting. So I think it's important to always consider the fact that adding stochasticity to your models is likely to change not just the shape of things, but the qualitative nature of the result. So in most situations, we get something that sort of looks like what we expect given the deterministic simulation that we've done before, but it's not necessarily going to be true every time. And if we add, I just want to add the deterministic simulations on top. If we add the deterministic simulations on top, we know that they're going to go through this like clutter of points, but not necessarily right in the middle of it. And so on average, we see the stochastic simulations that are following this trend, but they can be fairly significant deviations from that. And so whenever you say, oh, the model says that, but then we observe something different, it's because observation are accounting for the fact that we have some stochasticity in the processes that we don't have in the purely differential, non-stochastic differential equation version of it. So that's an illustration of how we can use these stochastic models. What I would like to do next is show you a little bit of notation that I think is really cool. And we'll probably again do both a stochastic and a deterministic version, but we're going to add some demography to the model. So the assumption we've made so far is that n, which is s plus I plus r, is a constant. It's never changing. And furthermore, it's never changing, but there's no new individuals that either enter or leave the pool. It's always the same individual all the time. We're going to change that. The specific way we are going to change that first is by adding some mortality. So we're going to add some mortality. I think the notation of that is beautiful. We are going to take S, and we are going to move them to a compartment which is empty. It's like, go away. You're removed from the model. Not in the sense that you now belong to the R compartment, but in the sense that you go into the empty set, which is you are no longer a part of this population. So what we've established here, right? We have the same rate of call that T for demography. We have the same rates of mortality, which is intrinsic mortality for all of our compartments. So do latexify of the SIRS. We also are going to check these equations and see what's wrong with them. So one thing that we don't have here at this time is that we don't have any natality. So the population is going to go extinct no matter what, because the sum of that is going to be minus mu times s plus I plus r at each time step, which is it's always going to be a negative value, and so the population is going to go extinct at some point. It's entire, like, regardless of the disease status, this is going to go to 0. We can make simulation if you want. We're going to set a time for a demographic event, which is going to be relatively slow. I know it's D. SARS. And then again, that's a question that we need to explore. What is the impact of having slow demographics versus fast demographics over time? Well, if we plot the solution, we have something that is a lot more complex. We have something that it's a bit more difficult to describe, right? If you were to try and put this curve into words, then we have something that's, it's more difficult to see what's going on. But the point is that the population is going to die off over time because there's only mortality. So we need to add some natality to that. And we're going to make a fairly bold assumption, which is that everyone reproduces at an equal rate. So any individual of S has a chance of creating a new individual of S. Was it 2S? I guess we'll see. And then it's also true for I and R. So everyone is reproducing. We have a model that is a little bit longer here. We're also going to be doing a quick latexify of that. Have a look at the equations. Plop them down here, render. Right, no, it's okay, I see what's wrong. So an individual of S, if there is a natality event, it's going to be 2S. And individual of I is going to be S plus I, and then it's going to be S plus R. So the initial individual is not modified. We're just creating one new, there is a net change of one susceptible individual. This, by the way, is also an assumption. We assume that all individuals are born susceptible. It's not the case for all, regardless of the immune status of the parents. That is not necessarily the case for all disease. Let me check what we have here. So we have the derivative of S over time is infection plus recovery minus mortality plus natality from S, from I, and from R. And then the dynamics of other compartments is the usual epidemics dynamics minus the demography. That works. So now we also have added some natality to that. Let's see how that is changing the dynamics. It is going to change the dynamics, by the way, necessarily, because this is going to result in an addition of new susceptible individuals over time. So we are going to apply a forcing to the model, which is everyone is dying at the same rate, but everyone is also creating new susceptible individuals at the same rate, right? So it's creating a new pool of individual over time. What if we make the demography much faster? Like instead of being insects, we're talking about bacteria, right? So like, what if we make the demography a lot faster? It's having a small effect. What if we make the demography faster than the epidemic dynamics? It's also changing that. What if we make the demography really long? Then it's sort of behaving as if there's no. It looks suspiciously like there is no demography in the model. We're going to pick 200, which was fine. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we may want to add in terms of the demographic impact of the disease is, of course, mortality. So to add mortality, we will add a new parameter, which is new. And it's going to be I goes into the empty set. And we have a new parameter new here. We need to find a thing here, and we can express that as what is the chance of you not recovering from the disease. So we're going to put that as being slightly larger than the recovery rate. We can redefine the model. Let's, you know what, before, let's just check the equations. I've made a mistake somewhere. Yeah, okay, yeah, run that. Run that. Okay, that's good. I'm going to check the equation of this new model. Oh, sorry. And what we would see here is that the rate of the size of the population is not going to be a constant anymore. If we do the sum of all derivatives, it's going to be minus nu I. That's because we are adding a term of mortality that is not compensated by anything, right? And so because we have this new term, we are going to see a loss of infectious individuals, not through recovery, but through mortality. That's another type of demographic event. Let's simulate this. And then do a little plot when it's done. And so that is changing the shape of the dynamic, of course. It's changing the shape because previously to that, the thing that could prevent you from creating more infectious individuals was that you recover from the infection. Now there's a new mechanism that is you can die before you had a chance to infect new people. And so a disease that is highly virulent, right, that has a high mortality, let's put it to 1. Really, really high mortality is not going to spread. It's going to be far too much virulent to spread. A disease that has very low mortality is going to spread as if there was no mortality at all, because it's just very, very small compared to the rate of other events. 6. Yeah, this one's fine. Okay. One thing that's interesting here, one thing that's very important that we had not mentioned yet, and that's a very deep intuition about the nature of immunity, I think, is that if we look at the proportion of individuals that are removed, before we added mortality, before we added demographics, it ended up remaining stable over time. You had a part of your population that had acquired immunity, and then it remained here. Now we are losing immunity over time, but we're also creating new individuals within the population that do not have immunity. Everyone enters the population being naive, and so at some point, not only do we not have any individuals that are infectious anymore, but we also have a population that is entirely susceptible, entirely naive. And so if a new infectious individual were to enter this population by the time we reach equilibrium, then it would be the same thing as if we started from initial condition with an entirely susceptible population. And I think it's interesting to show that we have the highest rate of immunity just after the peak, and so it decreases over time, either through the loss of immunity for the individual that remains, through their mortality, or through the fact that the new individual that we create are going to be susceptible. Let's take the same problem and make it a discrete one. It's DSIRS. So, same thing, right? We see that there's something that is, let's do that. Let's plot the solution on top. We see something that is looking slightly like, but is also fairly different from the deterministic solution, just because of stochasticity. What's happening here, let me give you the solution, is that there's a point where there's no more infectious people that is reached sooner than we expect. And so we end up with a population that, it's interesting, isn't it? That it's a population that is larger when the disease is gone. So there's been some mortality. So we went from 1,000 individual to about 500. But when we add some stochasticity, there's a scenario in which we have a final population size that is of about 750. So it's changing the state of the population in the end. There's a range of scenarios that we can have here. And if we run that a couple different times, we're going to have a couple different issues. Some of them are going to be much better, like the disease goes away on its own. Some of them are going to be possibly much worse. I don't think I'm going to find one that is much worse. But what is interesting here is that when you move from something that is deterministic to something that is stochastic, the range of situation that you can have is exploding, and so that is that should bring us to explore the parameters and their interaction in a different way. So before, when we wanted to know what happens when we have this value of transmissibility, and this value of recovery rate, we only needed to do one simulation. Well, now if we do something that is stochastic, because every simulation is going to be different, we need to do a lot more simulation, presumably, and we need to do something like what is the average and what is the standard deviation? Maybe what is the distribution of population size at equilibrium under these situations? So that's it's adding some realism. It's adding something to the model, but it's also requiring that we add some things to the analysis that we do. It's also makes things a little bit more complicated. And that is a fundamental trade-off in modeling. If you want to gain more realism, if you want to add things that brings you closer to what we think reality is, you're going to pay a price in complexity. It's not always going to be a price that is immense. Sometimes it's just, let's do a couple more simulations and take the average. That's fine. But there is a choice that you need to make. And so the decision of, what is my question? Does it require that I move from something that is deterministic to something that is stochastic? That needs to be evaluated very carefully. And if you realize that you need to do like 1 million different simulations and that will take 4 days, is it worth it? Is the price of complexity worth paying for the gain in accuracy or informativity that you would gain from the model? That's sort of that is a fundamental tension of modeling. One thing that is easing this tension is that we have tools that are getting increasingly performant over time. So doing more simulation is less and less of an issue because the simulations are faster to perform. We also have tools to analyze the results in ways that are more pleasant to work with, and so there's less cost overall in managing complex dataset and simulation outcomes. But it's still more work than solving the equations and then looking at the result. So that's something that will need to be evaluated. And for the specific project that you will need to complete by the end of these 3 classes and disease dynamics, I'm not going to tell you if you need to do a deterministic or a stochastic simulation. I'm just going to give you a problem and ask you a series of guiding questions so that you can make the decision for yourselves. And both answers are going to be correct and valid as long as they are properly justified. So that was an introduction to compartment models in epidemiology and how we can simulate them both as deterministic or stochastic version. Next week, we are going to talk about age a little bit. And we are going to take an example from, I'm not quite sure yet, but it's fairly likely that we will take an example from cattle viruses. We'll see, but something that has a simple age structure, and we can start thinking about how the development of individuals over time is interacting with the epidemic process. And then the class after that is going to be about space. What is the impact of thinking about epidemics in a especially explicit way instead of assuming that they happen within a box? And that is going to give you an overview of disease modeling. So I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.